So where do we start? Well, the easiest place to start when it comes to learning VBA is to learn about macros. Macros in Excel are very easy to record and run. And what most people don't realize is that every time they record a macro, what they are actually doing is writing VBA code. It's just that Excel is writing the code for them. So macros allow one to automate repetitive tasks in Excel, such as formatting of reports, emailing out reports, performing reconciliations, etc. Macros are recorded, edited, and run via the Developer tab, and the Developer tab may need to be enabled. It's not enabled by default when you open up Excel. So you can see over there in the picture, we've got File, Home, Insert, Page Layout, Formulas, Data, Review, and View tabs, and then we've got the Developer tab. On the Developer tab, you'll find Visual Basic, where we can actually access the Visual Basic editor, Macros, where we can see all of the macros that we've recorded, and we can run macros. Record a macro, so there's the button to start recording a macro, use relative references, which we will come to later, and macro security. Macro security is quite important. In order to run macros, we will need to disable some of the security features that are in place. And those security features are in place because of historical reasons and the fact that previously some macros were considered to be dangerous and were in fact dangerous. And we'll discuss that as well. So let's get on to recording a macro. So macros can be recorded via the Developer tab. If you do not have the Developer tab enabled, you'll have to go to File and Options via the Excel menu and enable the Developer tab using the tick box. Macros can be recorded via the Developer tab, as we've discussed, by clicking Record a Macro. And when you click Record a Macro, the Record Macro dialog box will open. On this dialog box, you can name your macro, and you can also assign a shortcut key. Again, something to be careful of is that any shortcut key you assign to your macro will overwrite the default Excel shortcut key. So for example, if you assign the shortcut key Ctrl+C, it will overwrite Excel's default shortcut for copying of data. Then we can choose where we're going to store the macro, and we can store the macro in a number of different places, and we'll discuss that shortly. And finally, we can also provide a description for a macro. This is also important because sometimes we're going to record a macro and then 3 or 4 months later on, we might not necessarily remember why we recorded the macro and what it does. And that's where the description is very useful. In terms of storing the macro, we're going to see where the different options are when we get to the example. So when you record the macro, it is very important to remember that Excel is writing the VBA code for all of the actions done. And literally everything that you do once you're recording macro is being recorded. So if you make a mistake and you type something to a cell and then delete it, Excel actually records that. It types something into the cell and then deletes it. So what's very useful when recording macros is to perform a practice run. Perform a practice run, make sure that you get the steps correct, and then record the macro. So for example, clicking on cells, typing text, deleting cells, formatting worksheets, inserting graphs are all recorded in the code format, and when you run the macro, it will attempt to do those things again. Excel records on a line-by-line basis, so everything that you do, Excel records a line of code for. And macros are then run on the very same line-by-line basis. Where should you store your macros? Well, there are 3 options that Excel gives us. You can either store it in the current workbook. If we do that, the macro is only available in this file, and we can't access the macro from any other Excel workbook. You can save it in a new workbook, and this option will open up a new Excel file, and then the macro is only available in the new workbook. If you want a macro that you want to be able to run on any Excel workbook that you download or open, then you should store the macro in your personal macro workbook. This option creates a hidden file called Personal XLS, which stores your macros and makes them available to you in all of the Excel files that you may open. As we discussed, when you're recording a macro, you need to perform the functions that you require the macro to record. Be very careful to remember that the macro will be used on all worksheets going forward, and not just this sheet. What do I mean by that? Well, if for example in column K you've got the date in this worksheet, in future worksheets, the date might not always be in column K, it might be in a different column. That's something to be aware of. Maybe you want to format a report and that in January, when you record the macro, the report is only 10 lines long. But in the future, it can be 20, 30, 40 lines long. You don't just want to record the macro to format only the first 10 lines. You want it to format any lines that may include data. Using things like Control-Shift-Down is very useful here. instead of using your mouse to go and select only the first 10 rows. Be very careful with copy and pastes. These will be repeated every time the macro is run. Remember that you can always re-record the macro or edit the VBA code later if you make a mistake. Always check to see if there's a formula for what you're trying to automate. I've had many delegates on my training courses come to me and say, I'm trying to record a macro to do the following. And I say, but there is actually built-in Excel functionality to do that. And one of the examples that I can point to is somebody wanted to delete duplicates in a column. And I said, but you can actually do that via the data tab. There's a button to delete duplicates. So always check to see if there's a formula or some Excel functionality to do what you're trying to achieve via macro. It's much easier than creating your own macro to do it. And then finally follow a logical process flow to complete the automated function. And again, practicing before you record the macro is very useful here. So when you are finished recording the macro, you can click Stop Recording in the Developer tab, or at the bottom of your Excel workbook, you'll see a little stop button, and when you hover over it, it will say Stop Recording. You can then run your macro by clicking on the Macros button, and when you click on that button, Excel will show you all of the macros that you have recorded that you can run. So when should we use a macro? Well, when we want to repeat automated tasks, when we want to minimize errors, especially if the automated tasks are very long and boring, when we want to easily format worksheets to create dashboards, reports, or find exceptions. And then always remember that VBA can be further used to email out those reports, or access other data outside of Excel, perhaps on a web page, or the current workbook, and act as an interface with other programs. Always remember that VBA can be further used to email out the reports, or access other data outside of Excel, the current workbook, such as data on a website, and act as an interface with other programs. Macros can save time, but should not be used as a full replacement for human supervision over work. It's always useful to have that human eye checking what the macros are doing to see if any errors have been carried through and to confirm that the macros are working correctly. Let's download the macro.xlsm workbook and let's try and create a macro that formats the worksheet. Download it and I'll work through this first example with you in the next video.